Is it recording? Yeah. Oh God. Anyway, so this is David. I'm going to be asking you a few questions for my special subject investigation. Firstly, do you believe that young people appreciate opera anymore? And if not, why?
I don't necessarily think it's ever been a thing that young people have been that into, not in a big way. I think there's been a minority of younger people that might have enjoyed opera, but that's probably like any other musical influence. It depends on your family background, what's been listened to at home, or what you're exposed to by your parents. If you're taken to see operas, even amateur productions of things, if your parents are musical and into it, otherwise you are drawn into different musical tastes that are more like popular music. So I don't necessarily think it's got less in recent times. I just think generally it's a minority of young people that would be interested.
Do you believe that years ago, and I'm talking like in the 17th century when it did used to be quite a big thing, do you believe that it's sort of decreased in popularity regardless as to whether you're young or old?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's become more elitist. It never used to be elitist, did it? And certain composers would write in the languages of the countries that the music was being performed, so it was made to be accessible to a wider audience. I think if we talk particularly about British culture, it's so overpriced as an entertainment form of entertainment that it does stop people seeing it and being exposed to it. The one thing that probably does help is these whether it's open air performances or ones that are televised, and now that they've started televising or showing them in the cinemas, that's maybe more likely to start getting an audience for people that can't afford to see it live.
Yeah. Have you ever thought that there's a stigma attached to people that enjoy opera?
Yeah. Because of the kind of classist attitude towards what opera is, if you show an interest in that type of music, people think, well, who do you think you are? I think, generally if we grow up in working to lower middle class family background environments, the people around you are judgmental anyway, wherever you're from. But if you're from that background, and I guess talking to you, you'll understand that more than most, is you stand out like a sore thumb. And that was the same for me. So yeah, there's
from your own experience, do you believe that the operatic scene has changed over the years to fit in with the new modern norm?
To an extent it has, yeah. It has. There's different producers, different directors getting involved or have got involved in the past even 20, 30 years. So not necessarily recent times, but there's been a big shift in how opera is presented. It's nice to see smaller touring opera companies. It's also good to see opera companies who might specialise in Baroque opera, or even doing medieval music and a bit of Baroque, and specialising and then bringing that to places that aren't necessarily concert halls, but going to like churches throughout the country and performing things like even the Beggar's Opera, which that's not necessarily opera, but yeah, it's definitely it's diversified in a lot of ways in the way it's presented. From your point of view, if you're looking at how things are presented, to do it in modern clothing, or to not change the story, but to just by transferring it into contemporary times makes it more accessible.
Because it's almost like, I know there was a director that did a new film of like Romeo and Juliet by obviously William Shakespeare, but they had Leonardo DiCaprio in it, but it was set in modern times, and instead of having swords and stuff, they all had guns and they were driving around in cars and they were all taking drugs apparently as well. And I think that made it a lot more popular because not that people could relate to the guns and the cars and the drugs, but because you see that a lot more nowadays, a lot more people can relate to it. Do you think that the talent shows like Britain's Got Talent and X Factor have kind of given opera and classical music a new life, as it were? Because obviously on X Factor or Britain's Got Talent, we obviously had Susan Boyle that sang I Dreamed a Dream from Les Mis, and that obviously, as soon as people heard that, they all thought, oh, this is from Les Mis, what is it? And then they wanted to go see what it was. Do you think that it's going to kind of promote more opera and classical, or do you think it was just a one-off?
That's a tricky one. I think people like, there was the duo last year, the sort of large guy and the girl, and I thought the girl was equally talented, but it was just because of how he looked that they thought, oh my god, a person who's large can sing, the same as the Susan Boyle kind of thing. I think there's always been a place for celebrity type of, like, people who suddenly appear and popularise. I think there are much more credible people to do that, like Alfie Boe. He did it in a great way, like Leslie Garrett, and you know, back in the day there was a period, I would say, was it early 90s, where there was Leslie Garrett, and then a bit later probably Russell Watson. Now Leslie Garrett's got a proper background, Royal College and all the rest, so properly trained, properly worked for years as a singer, but because she was northern and because she had a personality that came across really well, and she as a person became someone you could relate to. She then got her own TV show, and opera became popular through her. That was really healthy, I think, and younger people bought into it a little bit more, and more people than just young people bought into it. Russell Watson, on the other hand, didn't have that background. He popularised it, but there's an ego attached to him that is not fitting with his actual level of skill. I've seen him do documentaries where he's been singing something fairly standard repertoire, and he said he's refused not to put the music down. He said, I'm not putting the music down. How can I possibly sing in this language? Well, if he'd gone to music college and if he'd done the training, then that'd be fine. So he might have popularised it in a way, but I don't necessarily think he's telling people about the real opera and the true standards that are needed.
Do you think there's a lot of like stigma attached to opera because people just think that it's really easy and anyone can do it, and people don't know how hard you do actually have to work at it? Do you think that people should kind of, I don't know, it's difficult because obviously if people aren't going to like it, they're not going to listen to it anyway, but do you think that like more, when you're younger, there's a lot of shows on telly that promote like the boy bands and the girl bands? Like when I was little, I was listening to Steps and S Club 7 and bands like that. And obviously because of my parents, I was listening to like classical stuff as well. But do you think that there should be more promotion of like classical music, or do you just think it should just be left to each their own?
I do think that it should be promoted better. I think you need to break down the sort of stereotypes or the archetypal vision of what opera is all about. Because we still talk about when the fat lady sings, and it's sort of as if you have to look a certain way, and it's so distanced from reality, and it isn't necessarily the case. But that's like any style of music. If it's not being shown on mainstream media, it's not being talked about, if it's shoved away onto some arts channel, you're not going to access it so easily. To me, it's about school as well. It's about what you're being educated in. There's
friendship groups as well. And I have one more question, but I can't remember what it was.
It's alright.
Do you think that, like, obviously as time goes by, everything like evolves anyway? Do you think that there's going to be a sudden rush of everyone suddenly wanting to watch opera? Because obviously when Susan Boyle sang I Dreamed a Room from Les Mis, you know, a new film was made from it. It's now come out on a DVD. Everyone's going crazy because of it. Do you think that it's slowly coming back into, like, not necessarily fashion, because there was a time when it was the done thing to go see an opera, but obviously that was only if you had money. Do you think that it's kind of going to come back round again and more people are going to kind of make a fuss over it, or do you think it's just going to kind of stay almost underground, really?
There's been attempts to, I think when Baz Luhrmann did La Boheme on Broadway, and Alfie Boe was in that, and I think that really got his career off in a different direction, and then he ends up doing Les Mis and all sorts of things, and he's a real crossover artist, which is great. I think it's people like him that you can respect as proper musicians, who can do the crossover, who can be somebody you can relate to, you might enjoy him singing a Les Mis song, but then on his album you might have something else. And there was like Bryn Terfel in his day, he's still obviously still around, but singing the baritone songs from musicals, a proper opera singer at the same time. I think it's not necessarily had its day, and I don't think necessarily the older operas will become so popular again necessarily without a real push. But there's composers now writing things that are classed as opera that are set in modern times and musically are really listenable to. So that's not even a proper sentence, but you know what I mean. They're not things that you would think, oh, that's so. Some things are easy to listen to. Some things melodically so contemporary, and so like 20th century, jumping here, there, and everywhere melodically. But how do you get an audience is always the dilemma. How do you get an audience? So has it died, and will it ever come back? It will always be there. It's always a credible art form. To me, it's like any art form. It's about the money side of it that stops people seeing it. And if they would do more community kind of schools liaison, if different opera companies, which some of them do, if they got into schools and students really got a feel for that whole experience of singing an opera chorus for a day and being directed, and they might buy into it. But it's up to the people producing operas to connect with a younger audience, because if you stop selling to a younger audience, it will die out. Because the older folks, they're going to die out, and the younger people are not going to have the interest.
Have any idea.
Yes.
One final question. Obviously, you've got artists like the Three Tenors that are obviously extremely popular, and obviously Catherine Jenkins, etc., and Hayley Westenra as well. A lot of people know them because everyone knows who Pavarotti is, everyone's heard of him, and he's an opera singer. However, when it comes down to actual opera performances, quite a lot of people don't know, like they can't even name one. Why do you think that is? Why do you think there's such a big difference between like Pavarotti singing an opera, a song from an opera, and people actually going to watch an opera?
It's like anything. It's celebrity culture. It's the same within television castings. You see the same woman in 3 different TV series all in the same week, which is great because at that time her star is kind of rising and she's the face of the day. And someone like Linda Bellingham or something, but like Pavarotti, he became this name. He'd always been a singer, but he'd become a name, and then he sang for the World Cup, wasn't it? They thought, well, let's do Nessun Dorma, nothing at all to do with football, but we'll use that as an anthem. And I do believe it was from that point, wasn't it, that he became this sort of household name.
Yeah.
That's what it is. It's celebrity culture. It's laziness on the part of the world to even care to find out about other people who are actually probably a whole lot better, and we just buy into what is being marketed to us all the time. And it's infuriating as a musician, because you know yourself, other musicians in this world who are completely talented and blow you away with the way they sing, yet they haven't managed to get the career off the ground because they're not maybe marketable.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Red button again, yeah?